Scripture reading comes from Romans chapter 8, verse 15, 2 Timothy 1 through 7. So you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when He adopted you as His own children. Now we call Him Abba, Father. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline.
So maybe you noticed I'm breaking away from Romans this week. It's actually just one of those weeks where, as I started to work on Romans chapter 11, I just got the sense from the Spirit that this isn't what we're supposed to talk about today. And so instead, we're going to be looking at actually Mark chapter 5. So if you want to turn there in your Bibles or grab your phone or whatever you read the Bible on, go ahead and get open to Mark chapter 5. It won't be on the screen this week. I was actually finishing up this sermon this morning. So it's not typical for me, but like I said, when you try to go against what the Spirit is kind of leading you towards, you kind of find yourself coming up dry. So, but when I started working on this, it just flowed. So who knows? We'll see. But it's kind of interesting because I actually chose this passage to speak on, and then Richard told me what he was going to be speaking on over the next 2 weeks, and he's actually going to be talking about faith, which is kind of interesting. So apparently we were both led in the same direction. He's going to be kind of continuing this idea where we're talking about faith next Sunday, and maybe the next Sunday. I know the 2 weeks from today is our family Sunday. We'll have to talk about that. But anyways, Richard will be here for 3 Sundays, and he'll be teaching two lessons on faith. So we'll see how it works out. So fear is part of life. Have you been afraid lately? I mean, you don't have to answer that. It's a rhetorical question. Have you been afraid lately? I can think of some significant moments of fear in my life. I think of when I was in 6th grade and my parents decided to leave Searcy, Arkansas and move to Colorado. All my friends were there, our family was there, my cousins, I had uncles and aunts, and lots of people that lived there in Searcy, Arkansas, and we were moving to Colorado. My parents were going to be house parents in a children's home. You can talk to Croslin more about what that's like, but it is he had a chair thrown at him recently. I mean, stuff like that happens, right? I remember just being very, very scared when I was 12 years old, moving to Colorado. Another time of fear was when I was 18 years old. Actually, no, I was 19. And my parents dropped me off at Oklahoma Christian University for the first time as a freshman. I had no car and no friends. They dropped me off, and I remember them driving away. I mean, that vision of them driving away in our green minivan, our green Ford Windstar minivan, will ever be burned in my memory, because I just remember seeing them driving away and being like, what am I supposed to do now? like I'm here, and I don't know anybody. I had friends that were upperclassmen, but I was there for freshman orientation and they weren't there yet. So I just remember being very, very fearful. I remember when I was 27 years old, and I went to the doctor, and he said, that's cancer. And I had to have surgery. And some of you were here and remember that. And it was really, really, really scary. I remember being very afraid. And if you were to go back and read the journal entries in my prayer journal at that time, you would see the fear in me. And then I remember when my mom called me and said that she had cancer and that it wasn't looking good. And I remember just the feelings of fear and not knowing what to do, what to say, how to pray, what to think. And so I have no doubt that fear is or has been a part of your life at some point, and maybe it is right now. And I really feel that this is just an important message to talk about today. So I actually taught this passage in the youth class on Wednesday, and so I'm double dipping a little bit. But like I said, when I started working on this sermon, it just flowed and came out. So I hope this is meaningful to you today, and I hope that maybe you can look at the next week a little bit differently than it looks right now. So again, we're going to be in Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her. Heal her so she can live." So this story hits a special place in my heart. We'll find out later that this girl is 12 years old, and I have an 11-year-old. And so when I read this story, I can't help but see her in this story. And she is on the threshold of womanhood in this culture. When you're 12 years old, you're about to be a woman. Now, in the ancient world, you didn't have adolescents. You didn't have teenagers. I mean, they were teenagers in that they were 14 or 15, but they were not considered teenagers. You went from being a girl to being a woman. At 14 or 15 years old, they would often get married, and that was when they started their family. So she was literally just a couple years away from beginning her life as a wife, a mother, things like that. And she is sickly and almost passed away. She has everything ahead of her, and yet right now there's nothing ahead of her. And this had to take a lot of guts for Jairus to come and to seek out Jesus, because he is a synagogue leader. Okay, if you are familiar with the Gospel of Mark, you'll realize that Jesus has not been particularly popular with the religious folks of his day. They've accused him of having a demon. So, that's not very popular. His own family actually tried to come and take charge of him because they thought he was crazy. Like his mom and his brothers and sisters actually showed up at a point in a place where he was preaching and teaching, and they tried to take charge of him, Mark tells us, because they thought he was nuts. He was crazy. Jesus has been talking about this new kingdom of God movement in the world that he is bringing on. And that's not good for your health when you live in a place that is under Roman rule. You don't talk about other kingdoms when you are ruled by another kingdom, right? That's a way to get yourself killed or martyred. And so Jairus has to go through a lot of different barriers in order to finally get to Jesus. He has to face one fear because he's trying to find a solution to another fear. And really, honestly, at this point, he doesn't care what they say about him on the next Sabbath. He doesn't care about the political implications of what he's doing. He doesn't care about the religious controversy that this could bring up in his life. All he knows is that his daughter is dying, and he has to do something about it. And he's grasping at the last thing that he could imagine doing in his life. And that is reaching for somebody who is he's an outsider to the religious majority in that area. So let's keep reading. Verse 24. Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. And immediately the bleeding stopped. And she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, and so he turned around in the crowd and he asked, "Who touched me?" And his disciples are sarcastic. And they say, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he kept on looking to see who had done it. And then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." So these stories mingle together. They're meant to be taken together. If you're familiar with the writing of Mark, this is actually one of his literary devices that some people call a Markan sandwich, okay? So you have a story that starts, and then you have another story in the middle, and then you have the finishing of the first story after the middle story. So these stories are meant to be taken together. And so you have Jesus going to this little girl's house who is dying, and she is truly on the brink of death. I mean, otherwise Jairus wouldn't be there. He would not be there if she was not, literally probably hours from death. And it's actually more likely, based on Jairus being there and asking for Jesus' help, it's more likely that Jesus is going to show up and he's going to find a corpse, not a girl to heal. And so it's in places like this that, mingled with the sorrow of this family, you also have the threat of impurity. Because if you touch a dead body, it causes impurity. It causes you to be ceremonially unclean in the Jewish faith and religion. But here, you also have an unclean woman. She is somehow bleeding in a way that people notice. I mean, we don't know where or how she was bleeding. Mark doesn't tell us. I mean, it could be some sort of hemophilia. That was actually the suggestion of one of our teenagers on Wednesday night. Really smart kid, whoever said that. I don't remember who it was. It could be that she had some kind of perpetual menstruation problem. We really don't know. We don't know what's going on with this woman, but her bleeding is obvious. And I have to wonder at this point, how well did Jairus know this woman? He's a synagogue leader in a very small town, just a few hundred people. So he more than likely knows this woman. And as the synagogue leader in the town, he's aware of everybody. I mean, it's kind of like Cordell. Cordell, we're a couple 2,500 people, but in that place, it was a few hundred, right? And so you knew everybody's business. And so he knows that sometime around the time when his daughter was born, this woman started to deal with a bleeding disorder. So 12 years, this woman had been dealing with the bleeding disorder, and his daughter was 12 years old. And when you have a bodily discharge, you are considered ceremonially unclean. And that means that you can't take part of any of the Jewish religious festivals. And it also means that people don't want to touch you. People aren't allowed to touch you because they don't want to become ceremonially unclean. And it sounds to me, as I read this story, it sounds to me as if she is all alone in this struggle. There's no mention of a husband. There's just mention of her spending her hard-earned money, or maybe the money that her husband left her when he passed away, which is more than likely happened a lot in that ancient world. And she's been trying to treat this blood disorder for 12 years. 12 years. And she has just gotten worse. And so Jairus waits as Jesus interacts with this woman. And as Jesus asks, "Who touched me?" Jairus knows that his daughter is literally minutes away from death. And he's sitting there on, pins and needles like, I know that this woman has a terrible thing going on, but my daughter's about to die. He just got to be so conflicted at this moment. But then the woman is healed. And he's got to be thinking, maybe he can heal my daughter. We just have to get to her in time. But then this happens, verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking to her, the woman, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus. the leader of the synagogue, they told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now." And as I was meditating on this passage some this week, I stopped here for several minutes and just let myself soak in that news for a minute. The emotional roller coaster for Jairus has just gone off a cliff, right? There's nothing more devastating than losing a child. I can't think of anything more devastating. I've been in a hospital with a parent who lost their 14-year-old son to a devastating accident. April 24th, 2017. I will never forget that day. Never forget it. I've never witnessed firsthand greater grief. Wailing, yelling, shouting, disbelief. There's just nothing that hurts more. And I wonder if Jairus has just crumpled to the ground. Mark doesn't supply all the information, but he intends for us to participate in the story. And so I wonder if Jairus has just crumpled to the ground, sobs racking his body, and Jesus overhears that, right? He overhears the statement. And Mark doesn't tell us what Jesus does. But in my mind, he walks over to the grief-stricken parent, and he places a hand on the shoulder, and he bends down, and he gently says, "Don't be afraid. Just have faith." Which is the most ridiculous thing to say. Right? It's the most ridiculous thing to say. It's like, why don't you try and paddle across the Pacific Ocean in a canoe? That's what it is. Unless it's God in the flesh saying it. And then Jesus stopped. Verse 37, then Jesus stopped the crowd, and he wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So here Jesus is just acting in compassion. He doesn't want this crowd who's chattering about this amazing healing that just happened. He doesn't want them coming along and just making Jairus' grief unimportant, right? So he dismisses the crowd and he brings just Peter, James, and John with him. And then verse 38. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. Now, this doesn't make sense to us. What's the deal with the weeping and wailing? Well, see, in the first century world, there were actually professional mourners because loss of life was just so prevalent, so much more prevalent than it is now. I mean, how many people, just you don't have to raise your hand. How many people would be here today if it wasn't for modern medicine? I mean, there's probably several of us in this building who would not be here if it wasn't for modern medicine. And so death was so much more a part of life. And some of you know Jim Weaver. So Jim Weaver, he was kind of an interim minister here, one of my mentors here in Cordell. And he likes to go and visit graveyards. Did you know that about Jim? How many people, anybody know that about Jim? He likes to go visit graveyards. One time I went with him, and the reason he likes to go visit graveyards is because it helps him remember how precious life is. It helps him come to grasp with his own mortality. And so I went with him one day as we were walking around these graveyards and out here in one of these graveyards in western Oklahoma, and I was struck by the sheer number of deaths in the late 1800s and the early 1900s of children that were under the age of 10. It just, you'd go by these gravestones, and it was, they were 0 years old, or they were 1 year old, or they were 2 years old, or they were, 3, just very, very young. And the point is that children were especially vulnerable in the ancient world. And so, because there was so much loss of life, there were professional mourners who would come and join families in their grief, weeping and wailing so that those families didn't have to do it alone. And I actually think that would be a helpful thing today sometimes. Because the sad thing is that there's not good ways to grieve in our world today, in our Western world. Our world has said, well, you shouldn't be sad, or you shouldn't be upset or angry, or, whatever it is. Our world does not know how to grieve. We have pushed grieving to the side. But in this world, when there was sadness or death or loss, the grievers, the mourners would show up, and you'd be encompassed in this cloud of mourning where you could let it out, right? Let it out. But Jesus decides that he's going to break this party up. Verse 39. He went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? Why? This child isn't dead. She's only asleep." And the crowd laughed at him. So this shows the general consensus about Jesus, right? This shows what people think. This shows how far off the rails people believe that Jairus has gone to go and get a hold of Jesus. And it's really not surprising, because like I said, in the previous chapters, Jesus has been accused of demon possession. His own family thought he was crazy. He's been called a Sabbath breaker. He's been called all these different things. And so the crowd is laughing at this quack of a prophet, talking about a new kingdom movement and how he labels this girl as not dead but asleep. Because everybody knows what a dead person looks like. Let's continue reading. But he, Jesus, made them all leave. And he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means in Aramaic, "Little girl, get up." And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. And they were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Isn't that like the most understated sentence? They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Thank you, Mark, right? Like, come on, Mark, tell us more. But we can fill in the gaps, right? We can fill in the blanks. You know what was going on in this situation. There was hugging, there was kissing, there was shouting, there was joy. There was, lots and lots of tears and blubbering. And there's just all kinds of stuff. All the stops were pulled out. They were overwhelmed and amazed. Of course they were, Mark. Of course they were. And this moment changed this family's life forever. All priorities would be reorganized around this quack, this crazy prophet from Nazareth. And then Jesus does the strangest thing. Verse 43. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. Don't tell anybody? Are you kidding me? That's crazy. What? Why would he say, don't tell anybody? So that's number one question on my mind. But the second question that actually, in my opinion, is above that one is, why doesn't Jesus do this for everyone who believes and has faith? Why doesn't Jesus save our loved ones? Why doesn't Jesus come swooping down and heal every hospital case, every person that is about to cross over to meet their maker? Why doesn't Jesus do something about these things? Because it seems incredibly unfair. It seems incredibly unfair. But that question misses the whole point of the larger story that Mark is telling us. Just like Jesus didn't come to be a one-man liberation from Rome movement, he also didn't come to be a one-man emergency medical center. It's not why Jesus came. He was indeed starting a revolution by bringing God's healing power, but his aim was deeper than the surface problems. These amazing miracles were signs. They were signposts of the real revolution, the real healing that God was going to accomplish through Jesus' own death and his resurrection. Now, the signposts, they're important, right? but they aren't the destination. And so Jesus tells them to be quiet and not tell anyone because the destination has not been reached yet. And the destination is Jesus overcoming death and the grave. See, Jesus will meet death one day from this story. From this story in the future, Jesus is going to meet death one day. And that death is what threatens God's beautiful creation. And on that day, Jesus meets death. He will defeat death in a completely unexpected way by submitting to it. And that time, he will command his disciples to go and tell. Because he will submit to death, and then he will be raised, and then he says, now go and tell everybody. Shout it from the highest mountaintop, what God has done. So in closing, I just want to ask you, what parts of your life are currently being controlled by fear and death? What parts of your life? Now, it's easy for us to point at other people and say, well, they're not living by faith. And this is where they need it. It's a lot harder for us to take some time and look internally at ourselves and ask, what parts of my life are being controlled by fear and death? Where would Jesus whisper to you, don't be afraid, just have faith? Because you see, if the bleeding woman hadn't been courageous enough to step forward after being healed, she never would have heard the beautiful words that Jesus said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. If Jairus had not been courageous enough to buck up against the culture, 12 years of life would have been all he got with his daughter. That would have been it. And my question for you is this. Is there something that you are trying to protect and at the same time holding it back from God, holding on to it? Because when you do this, you're missing out on what God is trying to do in the world around you. Is there something that you're trying to hold on to protect, to feel safe, to feel good about your life and where you are? Is it time to let go? Is it time to release fear and say, Lord, I'm going to live by faith? That's for all of us to decide. Romans chapter 8, verse 15. We've read this, but I want to read it again. So you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when he adopted you as his own children. Now we call him Abba, Father. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. One of my favorite sayings from someone is something that Melanie Hubbard says, and she's not here this morning, and that is that fear is not of God. She says that all the time. Whenever you start to feel fearful, she says that to me. And I just want to remind all of us this morning, fear is not of God. It is human. It's part of life. It's something that we all experience. But fear is also the opportunity to grow in faith. And James, the brother of Jesus, says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Right? This is the opportunity for your faith to become something that it was not before. Right? It's an opportunity to grow. And so I just want to end with that. Like, let's remember, If today you are living in fear, this is God's invitation to grow in faith. So let me pray for you and me, not just you, me as well. And then we'll sing a song, and we'll be done today. Father, this is a hard story. There are people in this room who have suffered great loss. There are people in this room who are fearful. And I pray, Father, that we would accept this as your invitation to grow in faith. Lord, help us not to be ruled by fear. Because, Lord, if we are ruled by fear, we are ruled by death. And, Lord, you have given us life through Jesus. He has overcome death and the grave. Grow our faith, Father. Please grow our faith. Pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. Stand and sing.